Welcome everyone. In this lecture we're going to take a look at domestic and intimate partner violence, specifically within the LGBTQ plus community. Of key importance is to highlight some of the differences and some of the major issues faced by this community, as opposed to a lot of the research that we've looked at so far, which focus primarily on heterosexual couples. So we're going to look at some of those major issues to begin with. We're then going to highlight some of the differences between same-sex and heterosexual couples. We're also going to take a specific look into problems and issues faced by younger individuals of the LGBTQ plus community. And then finally, we're going to break even beyond the binary conception of gender and look at some of the specific issues faced by transgender individuals. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we think about the definitions that we have seen so far in this course, most of the definitions of intimate partner violence have characterized and described and defined domestic violence and intimate partner violence as being almost exclusively as a heterosexual woman's problem. We saw this in a prior lecture when we talked about some of the specific issues facing male victims of domestic violence, even in heterosexual relationships. And as you can imagine, some of the same issues and nuances that are overlooked in the law or in the research or the literature are also faced by the LGBTQ plus community. Looking at the research that's out there, intimate partner violence and domestic violence appears to occur in same-sex couples with approximately the same frequency as heterosexual couples, but there's questions about the accuracy and validity of the data, because as we're looking and as more research is looking into domestic violence and domestic abuse for this particular community, we're seeing that many same-sex victims do not report the abuse. And in fact, the numbers who do not report may even be higher than what we've seen previously in heterosexual couples. Now, why don't they report the abuse? Well, one of the key things, and we'll see this come back in one of the later slides, is fear of homophobic reactions. Now, that may be homophobic reactions by the community at large, fear of homophobic reactions by law enforcement, and the list goes on. So that is one of the things that is definitely unique for these individuals. And kind of in line with some of the fear of homophobic reactions, it's also just a sense and fear of biases coming from police, social service providers, and even court personnel. And we'll take a look a little bit deeper into that in just a moment. So what's the takeaway? When we want to think about the frequency of victimization for this particular community of individuals, the data are going to be inconsistent. And it's also a reason why we need to further examine and conduct more research in this area, specifically with this population of individuals, to start to get a more accurate count of the depth of the problem. So let's go back to that idea of what we saw just a second ago about the biases, the lack of education, lack of training. These are one of the key things that are sort of at the base of where we have biases that may come from police, social service, etc. Oftentimes it's not necessarily intentional. Sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's not intentional. It's more due to lack of education, lack of training, lack of awareness of working with this particular population of individuals. One of the issues that comes up is that police officers have been found to be more likely to view violence between partners of the same gender as mutual or consensual abuse. Just like some of the old stereotypes that we found with heterosexual couples, where it was not uncommon for law enforcement officers to assume when they were called out to a particular situation that the woman was the victim, the male was the perpetrator. That same issue is even further exacerbated when they're called out to situations where you have two women, two men, or a transgender individual involved in the relationship, and the police are not adequately trained to recognize who the actual perpetrator is and who the victim is. Underlying that and adding to that problem is that research has shown that across the nation, we still find reports of police officers continuing to express certain levels of homophobia, or sort of a fear or anger or misunderstanding of same-sex relationships. Now, obviously, this is not speaking about every police officer. No way am I trying to say that, but there are pockets and there are areas where this continues to be a problem. And then also we notice that few police officers, even if they've received training on how to respond to a domestic abuse situation, they oftentimes don't receive training that is necessary for distinguishing the actual abuser, specifically when you have a same-sex situation. So oftentimes it's not uncommon for both individuals to be arrested or for there to be a misidentification, and that the victim oftentimes ends up being the one arrested as opposed to the perpetrator. And then also, as we'll also take a little bit deeper look at in a couple slides, legislation across the country, although it is moving forward in many areas, it is still tailored specifically to same-sex couples. And the differences from state to state still show many of these underlying biases and homophobic sort of feelings even within our legal system. Let's take a little closer look at some of the biases, education, and training issues that are faced specifically by the LGBTQ+ community. In one study by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, the NCAVP, the police were called almost twice as many times as a prior year, and arrests increased by 135. So we saw police being called out to same-sex domestic violence situations more often. We saw the number of arrests increasing quite a bit. So that sounded like a good sign. They were starting to recognize the problem. They were responding. But, and this is the bad part, the reported cases of misarrest and police misconduct also increased quite a bit. 144% for misarrest and 74% for police misconduct. So although police were being called out to situations, were being brought into the actual situation itself, their response was not adequate. And what we see, and I alluded to this on the previous slide, is that oftentimes due to the lack of appropriate training for law enforcement officers, we see that if they're called out to a situation, they may see the situation as being one of mutual combat, and therefore they'll have charges or arrest handed out or meted out upon both individuals, particularly between relationships between two men. And then police officers arriving on the scene, even those with a proper understanding of the dynamics of same-sex situations and intimate partner violence, may not be able to easily distinguish the first aggressor if both men are injured, or if they both are unwilling to reveal that there is a danger to them. So if they deny that there's a danger to them if they remain, which makes it hard for law enforcement officers to respond effectively. So all these considerations, the biases, the lack of education and training, all these can factor into the decisions that LGBTQ victims must make when attempting to try to break out of that cycle of violence, and oftentimes will serve as a strong deterrent to getting help. So sort of one of the takeaways is clearly, hopefully you get the idea that we need to continue to better educate and better train our law enforcement officers who are responding to any form of domestic violence situation, and especially be able to recognize the subtle nuances when they're faced with a same-sex situation so that they can effectively identify the aggressor as well as the victim in order to help the victim. And also trying to break the old cycles of biases and homophobic reactions is also going to be key if we want to sort of empower the victims to be able to reach out and trust law enforcement, trust social service providers, etc., in order to get help and actually speak out when they know that they're being victimized. We also need to take a look at the problems with legislation. Now, within this course and many other courses you've taken under this major, obviously you've seen changes in our views and our laws and our policies about marriage, about drug use, about all sorts of things over the years. And one of the tough things that we still are sort of stuck in the dark ages also deals with domestic violence. And it's not just domestic violence legislation in general, but in particular, it is how the legislation is written and oftentimes how it ignores or even punishes individuals who are not in a heterosexual relationship. So same-sex situations oftentimes are completely ignored. As we can see, many jurisdictions, their legislation that refers to intimate partner violence defines it in a way that, even whether it's just by accident or oversight, or in some cases people would argue that it's done on purpose, excludes same-sex couples. So you may not even be depending upon which jurisdiction you live in across the United States, you may not even be protected under IPV or domestic violence laws if you're in a same-sex couple. Some examples. Delaware, Montana, and South Carolina explicitly exclude same-sex survivors of intimate partner violence from protection under criminal laws. So these are the most, archaic ones that we see, but it's not that uncommon when we really look across the United States. 18 states have intimate partner violence laws that are gender neutral, but they apply to household members only. And so we think about the fight that we've had in this country over the last decade or two for equal rights and same-sex marriage and things of that nature. A lot of those things are still sort of stuck when we look at laws pertaining to intimate partner violence and domestic violence, where if you're in a relationship, unless you're in a marriage or a legal union, or you've been cohabitating for a long period of time, you're not protected. And 30 states, including the District of Columbia, have intimate partner violence laws that are gender neutral and include household members as well as dating partners. That's what we want to see, and we'd like to see a push for all states, all jurisdictions having gender neutral laws, as well as recognizing individuals and relationships that are larger than that narrowly defined definition of only being between cohabitating individuals. So let's now turn the page and take a look at some of the key differences that we're finding over and over again when we look at the research and comparing same-sex relationships with heterosexual relationships. So LGBTQ abusers often utilize highly specific forms of abuse, including outing or threatening to out a partner to family, friends, or employers. So this is one of the unique ways in which abusers can sort of bring in those coercive control tactics to have power over their victim. Because of the unique nature, people oftentimes who are in an LGBTQ relationship may not have their sexual status known by family members, by coworkers, by the general public. And so, but being able to use that as a weapon against a victim can be a really dangerous thing. And also because of the underlying biases and sense of homophobic reactions that still pervade various areas across the country, abusers are also able to use that as a form of power in order to reinforce fears that no one's going to help them because they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. So it's this not only being able to control them, but it's also that idea of being able to alienate them and socially isolate them. Other concepts that we've talked about before. And because there is also sort of a misleading conception that abusive behavior between a same-sex or within a same-sex couple is somewhat of a normal part of that LGBTQ relationship, this has also found its way as to be another tool that abusers are able to use. So we see with these three different things, the power of being able to out somebody, the power of playing on those homophobic fears and biases, the misconception about the nature and dynamics of a same-sex relationship. These are all things which add to the arsenal of abusers and allow them to have more controlling tactics, as well as ways to isolate the victim. Sadly, another thing that research has shown us is that intimate partner violence amongst the LGBTQ community may not be declining. We spoke earlier on in this course about one of the best things we've seen going back to the 1970s and the start of the domestic violence revolution was a passage of where awareness was shelters and recognition. Then we had under the Clinton administration, the VAWA Act, and from there we've seen a growth and more of a focus on protecting survivors and victims of domestic abuse. And we saw rates decline across the country, which was great. However, the research looking specifically at same-sex couples may not tell the same story for that particular population of individuals. And some research has found that the total reported cases of same-sex intimate partner violence actually increased between 2008 and 2009, and increased again between 2010 and 2011. So the question is it simply an increase, or is it that there's more reporting? And we'll talk about that in a second. We've also seen that intimate partner violence homicide for same-sex couples increased more than threefold between 2010 and 2011. So although these points on this slide make it look like a dangerous area where we have not had a domestic violence revolution for the LGBTQ community, others would raise the question that maybe there's not an actual increase, but maybe we're getting to a point where there is the beginning of a revolution for this community. And maybe because there's more of awareness of the issues faced by this community, and maybe because we're starting to empower victims to be able to reach out, seek help, report cases, that maybe some of these increases are actually due more to a reporting increase, which actually in some ways would be a good sign. And as we've talked about before, even one case of domestic abuse is not a good thing. But if these numbers actually reflect a reporting increase and sort of the empowerment of individuals in same-sex relationships, and giving the victims a sense of they feel like they're starting to earn respect in the community. And we notice some of this also corresponds to legislation that sort of eased restrictions on same-sex marriage and other sort of legal restrictions for same-sex couples. So the answer to this really hasn't been played out. We don't know as of right now whether or not we have seen actual increases or if they're actual reporting increases, but it's a reason, you know, there's a silver lining, I'll just put it that way, that we're hoping that it's not an actual increase, that maybe people are feeling a little bit more empowerment to report these cases, which will help us to move forward to get a better understanding of the true amount of same-sex domestic abuse and intimate partner violence abuse, and also start to find ways to get help for the victims and survivors of these relationships. Another area where we see a unique nature for LGBTQ victims is that their sort of access to shelters. And sadly, oftentimes they are screened out, quote unquote, screened out from shelter care. What do I need? What do I mean by that? So shelter services we've found are a particular weakness for the LGBTQ community. Why is that? Although we have seen an increase in available shelters for heterosexual women in the United States, they're oftentimes not available to the LGBTQ community, as lesbian and gay men in particular are often screened out. They're not deemed to be eligible to be at one of these shelters. And even when shelters do admit LGBTQ individuals, they may still perpetrate institutional biases ranging from subtle aggression, such as judgmental looks or making assumptions about sexual orientation or gender identity, to more severe institutional discrimination, such as limiting the individual's length of stay in the shelter. So we still see these sort of homophobic feelings, the sense of biases that are really hindering our advancement or our opportunities to help individuals within this community. Also, we find that some shelters force transgender individuals to conform to their assigned gender roles in order to even be eligible for the services, or minimize the existence or impact of intimate partner violence in LGBT communities. So one more way that we're further adding another barrier to the victims in these relationships is when we're not only not accepting them into our shelters, but even if they are accepted, they're accepted with a sense of bias, they're accepted with only minimal lengths of stay, or being accepted only if they're willing to conform to a gender identity that is not who they are. And this is these are several of the barriers we have to work with. We spoke earlier about some of the issues and the lack of shelters available and resources available for men. And so, you know, as we can see, we're still this sort of old patriarchal heterosexual notion of domestic violence in many ways, where a lot of the focus has been on women and heterosexual women in particular. And once we think about victims that don't fit the heterosexual woman stereotype, male victims, LGBTQ victims, transgender victims are often overlooked or completely shut out of receiving help. And in some cases, survivors seeking to leave an abusive situation will resort to alternative or informal ways of help, such as staying in less secure arrangements, such as homeless shelters, inexpensive hotels, or motels. And unfortunately, those places, not only do they not have necessarily the resources to help victims of domestic abuse, but they often open the door to other particular problems and areas of victimization for these individuals. And when we think about the way that shelters have classically been designed, right? And we think, and I will go back to that stereotypical, the heterosexual woman fleeing from a male partner. Well, one of the ways that the shelter can do to protect her is they will not allow men into the shelter. And that's kind of been a pretty easy way for them to sort of recognize his awareness. We watched a documentary, the private violence documentary, where we saw how hard many of the advocates and shelter workers would do, or the work that they would do to assist and make sure that the male perpetrator could not get close in proximity to the female victim. Well, when you have a same-sex situation, the abuser may be able to go into the shelter and claim that they are the victim, right? So once again, it's trying to figure out, how do we recognize the perpetrator and the victim? So the abuser may have access to the same shelter, and shelter staff may not be adequately trained in screening for the primary aggressors. Also, abusive partners may pose as a victim in order to prevent the actual survivor from accessing the limited available shelters or social services. So you can imagine a situation where if the partner, or excuse me, if the abuser feels that the victim is going to leave them or seek help with the shelter, if they get to the shelter first and tell their false story and act and pose as if they're the victim, all of a sudden now the poor victim is completely shut out from that shelter. And for those who wish to leave their abusive relationship, alternatives like staying with friends or family are less likely to exist, because an LGBTQ survivor may have been ostracized by his or her home community on the basis of their sexual identity. Once again, that same pervasive, the biases, the homophobic reactions, barriers that we have yet to completely break down. And LGBT communities tend to be small and relatively tight-knit. So confidential housing options of any kind may be limited or even non-existent, right? When you have when everyone seems to know one another within your community of friends or social circle, it's hard to hide from an abuser if everyone knows everyone else's business. And these factors often exacerbate a survivor's sense of isolation and the belief that they have nowhere else to go. There we see it again, right? One of the things we've seen throughout this course, those components of control, power by the abuser, and then that sense of isolation and alienation for the victim are coming up even stronger for individuals in this community. We'll shift the page now a little bit and let's talk about some of the specific impacts that face youth. So LGBTQ community members who are young. And oftentimes the research will refer to these individuals as sexual minority youth. So young members of the LGBT community are at particularly high risk for intimate partner violence. We found research shows that survivors under the age of 30 make up almost 40% of those who report. So once again, the reporting may be a good thing, but also that's clearly an indicator of problems and victimization. So a large percentage of the individuals who are reporting intimate partner violence are under 30. The highest proportion of survivors were young adults, ages 19 to 29. Followed by even younger individuals, 15 to 18. Rates of childhood physical, sexual, and emotional abuse are consistently higher for sexual minority youth than for their heterosexual peers. So not only do we see once an individual is in a relationship where we can have things such as domestic abuse, intimate partner violence abuse, but these individuals, unfortunately, especially young individuals in the LGBTQ community are at higher rate of victimization or a higher risk of victimization for just general physical, sexual, and emotional abuse by members of their community, members of their family, classmates, schoolmates, workmates, which just adds, once again, more of the sense of alienation and the sense of loss for these individuals. In fact, these individuals are 4 times more likely to suffer sexual abuse than their heterosexual peers. They're 10% more likely to be exposed to domestic violence. And bisexual youth are at even a greater risk for physical abuse than their gay and lesbian peers. And oftentimes, research shows is because of this sense of, and not to sound crass about it, but it's a sense of within the sort of the adolescent community and the young adult community, it's the sense of people like to what we call essentialize people. They like to say, are you straight? Are you gay? In that sense. And for these poor individuals who are recognized as being bisexual, their risks for physical abuse is even higher than the gay and lesbian peers. And then also we notice that females who experience childhood physical or sexual abuse are at a greater risk than abused males for sexual assault later in life. So when we find that young lesbian individuals, not only the fact that they're female puts them at a higher risk for various types of abuse, but if they're lesbian, that compounds this problem. So we can see what we see here is it's not just in this page, I hope that sort of the takeaway is it's not just that these youth or these individuals are part of the LGBTQ community, it's also because of their age, because of their gender, things of that nature that also compound the risk of victimization across multiple areas. And then as we move beyond the binary, let me get all these up here. Here we go. Apologize for the weird slide on this one. But when we move beyond the binary, we find that research suggests that as many as 1 in 2 transgender individuals are victims of intimate partner violence. And also we see different types of manifestation for transgender individuals. So the same types of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, financial, that occur in intimate partner violence amongst cisgender people occur in relationships that include a transgender person. But the key thing is research is showing us more and more that an abusive cisgender partner may target vulnerabilities unique to transgender individuals and use them to further dominate and control the individual. So recall, if you're unfamiliar with the term cisgender is somebody who identifies with the sex of their birth. So if they are born as a man, regardless of their sexual orientation, a cisgender individual is somebody who recognizes, if they have male genitalia, they recognize themselves as a man, and the same thing for women, as opposed to transgender individuals. So this sort of dynamic, once again, transgender individuals have even more barriers that they have to overcome. So how do abusers further target transgender individuals? Well, one is by threatening to disclose the transgender individual's gender identity or birth assigned sex to others who may respond negatively, such as employers or family members. And then other ways are withholding finances that might be necessary for transgender specific medical services, such as hormones and surgeries, or items for expressing their authentic gender identity, such as clothing, wigs, makeup, and chest binders. And then also we think about, the abusers, once again, always looking for chinks in the armor. Where can I hurt somebody the most? And we see that abusers will often focus on the transgender person's unwanted features, such as those associated with their birth assigned sex, and they may refer to these as reasons the transgender person isn't a real man, isn't a real woman. And then finally, we see that oftentimes they'll target those specific body features during physically violent incidents to further once again, get at the points that are really going to hurt the individual. So what we've seen here is when we look at the LGBTQ plus community, there are a lot of the barriers faced by other victims of domestic violence and domestic abuse, including, having an abuser who uses tactics of coercive control, financial control, isolation, alienation, things of that nature. But it's compounded for these individuals because of many of the biases that exist in the world, homophobic feelings held by individuals, outdated legislation, outdated policies for shelters and services. And then also we think about some of the unique components specifically for younger members of this community, as well as individuals in the transgender community. So we'll wrap up for there, and we'll see you at the next lecture.